The DC fandom is broken. There are full-on battles happening on social media between DC fans who have completely different views about what their favorite characters stand for. People are forcing weird comparisons between random scenes from Man of Steel and the new Superman movie, either trying to make Snyder look bad or trying to make James Gunn look bad. There's drama, insults flying all over the place, and even people blocking their friends just because they're on the other side of the fandom. But where did this rift even come from? And why do fans get so touchy when it's brought up? Today, we're going to look at how such a massive fandom got split in two, and why it's almost impossible to get DC fans back on the same page. It all started back in 2013, when Man of Steel came out. Before that, the DC fandom was pretty much united. Everyone more or less agreed on things, no matter their age or whether they liked comics, animated shows, or going to the movies. Most fans agreed that Alan Moore and Grant Morrison had written the best Superman comics. Everyone saw Christopher Reeve as the best Superman on screen, and all the Batman fans were embarrassed by Batman and Robin. But then Warner did a reboot of Superman that promised to be totally different from anything before. Trying to compete with the MCU, they brought in the successful Zack Snyder and Christopher Nolan to tell a new kind of Superman story. This movie didn't have the innocent and hopeful tone of Richard Donner's films. It was more serious, epic, dark, and realistic. It felt way more like The Dark Knight or the Fox X-Men films than any past Superman adaptation. This Superman was struggling, and he was far from being a perfect icon or a pure symbol of hope. This was a huge deal. Sure, Man of Steel was well received by casual audiences and did great at the box office, but it introduced us to a very different Superman. Snyder and Nolan questioned the character's classic values to try and make him more modern and move away from the failure of Superman Returns. But not everyone was happy about that. For example, Jonathan Kent wasn't the perfect dad anymore. He wasn't the moral compass guiding Clark into becoming the world's greatest superhero. Halfway through the movie, he tells his son he maybe should have let a bunch of kids die, just to keep his identity a secret. Some people saw that as very human, like a flawed dad just trying to protect his kid, unsure of what to do. But others saw it as totally going against the comic version of the character, and a straight-up insult to the source material. I hate it! Snyder also ran with the idea that DC characters are like gods walking among humans, but he reimagined it to make Superman feel more like a Jesus figure. He had Clark go to a church for advice and even put him in the classic Jesus pose, hinting that this version of Superman was going to be more than just a superhero. He was going to be a religious symbol. That made a lot of fans uneasy. And then we got to the most controversial moment of the whole movie. Superman chose to kill Zod to protect humanity because he felt he had no other option. Instead of finding another way that didn't make him the last Kryptonian in the universe, Superman brutally took him out. He broke a rule that had been part of his character for decades, and that sparked tons of arguments online. Some people loved this fresh take, and said it finally made Superman make sense to them. He wasn't boring anymore, and now they could actually be fans of the character. But others were really skeptical, because this just wasn't the Superman they grew up with. The ground had already started to shake, but there wasn't a real crack in the fandom yet. Man of Steel was good enough to keep everyone on the same page. There were debates about whether this was the Superman we needed or not. A few folks even said it felt like a knockoff of Nolan's Batman, and that this dark tone didn't really suit the Man of Steel, since Cavill's Superman didn't feel inspiring. But overall, the movie worked well enough as a solid starting point for a cinematic universe. There wasn't any reason to fight yet, because DC fans still wanted to see their favorite characters on the big screen, and they wanted the DCU to compete with Marvel. But a big quake could happen at any moment, and split the fandom for good. That earthquake was called Batman v Superman.
Why did you say that name?
3 years after Man of Steel, Snyder directed a direct sequel starring DC's biggest heroes. Expectations were sky high, since this was going to be the first time Superman and Batman crossed over on the big screen. Plus, the trailers had little nods to The Dark Knight Returns, one of the best Batman comics ever. It really looked like the DCU was ready to go head-to-head with Marvel, using a totally different formula. At the time, the MCU was sticking to a classic action-adventure style, like Star Wars and Indiana Jones. They told fun, family-friendly stories with epic moments and some humor, but they never really dove into deep philosophical stuff or political topics that could divide the audience. Snyder, on the other hand, went all in on being provocative. He leaned hard into the political consequences of Superman intervening around the world. He packed in even more religious symbolism than in Man of Steel, and even added a kind of pseudo-philosophical monologue about God. Batman v Superman almost felt like a political thriller with superheroes, without jokes or fun moments. It was a super serious film, and at times even kind of depressing. While Marvel's heroes were out there saving the day with a smile and giving you a good time at the movies, Superman said this:
"No one stays good in this world."
You look sad, Superman.
Snyder and the old DCU became the total opposite of Marvel in every way. These heroes had gray morals. They couldn't always save everyone. There were no jokes, and the tone stayed epic the whole time, never really letting the audience relax. Even the visuals were a contrast. The heroes' costumes were dark and barely had any color to make everything feel more serious and realistic. There's no denying Snyder had a super distinct style and personality. He used super saturated shots and slow motion like every 5 minutes. You didn't need to go to film school to realize this was not a Marvel movie. This sparked mixed reactions. On one side, it was a hit with MCU haters who had been waiting for something bold and different. This was the superhero movie style they'd always wanted. They praised Snyder as the only one who could save them from Marvel's repetitive formula. We'll call this group the pro-Snyders. But just like anyone with a strong personality and a very specific vision, Snyder also gained a bunch of haters. These DC fans thought Batman v Superman was just edgy for no reason, and even more childish than the MCU, like a kid putting on a leather jacket and sunglasses to try and look grown up. The folks who were already unsure about Man of Steel now fully turned against Snyder. They saw him as a threat who was going to ruin their favorite heroes. They wanted him gone from DC before the damage became permanent. To simplify, we'll call this group the anti-Snyders.
I really hate him.
These two groups just couldn't agree on anything. The pro-Snyders wanted Zack to keep going with his story and his style, while the anti-Snyders wanted to switch directions as fast as possible. That didn't necessarily mean they wanted DC to turn into a Marvel knockoff. A lot of them weren't even sure what they wanted exactly. Some were hoping for a return to the Richard Donner tone, others wanted something like what Nolan had done, and some were dreaming of seeing the Timverse in live action. But what they did know was that they didn't want to see Snyder ever again. The debate between these two groups was anything but friendly. The anti-Snyders didn't just go after the look, the themes, or the way Snyder told the story in Batman v Superman. They tore into the script and how it was executed. They roasted the Martha scene, cringed at Lex Luthor, were mad about how Doomsday was wasted, and hated how the Justice League was awkwardly shoved into the story. They picked apart every plot hole and convenient twist, hoping Warner would hit the brakes and change direction. And they went head-to-head with the pro-Snyders, who pulled out a trap card just like Yugi Muto. A lot of them admitted that Batman v Superman had script issues, but they said the real problem was the evil studio, which didn't let Snyder bring his full vision to life. The real Snyder movie was the extended version, which never made it to theaters because it was over 3 hours long.
3 hours. 3 hours.
In the end, the extended version didn't really change anyone's mind. It's a bit more solid than the theatrical cut. But if you didn't like that one, the extended one wasn't gonna win you over either. No anti-Snyder suddenly switched sides after watching it, so the arguments kept going like nothing had changed. But here's what really mattered. Here's when the whole creator versus studio narrative started. Like Snyder and Warner were suddenly enemies. To the pro-Snyders, Zack wasn't just some Warner employee taking orders from the execs. Since they believed his vision was the right one for this universe, they were convinced the studio should never interfere again, like they did with Batman v Superman. If they did, they would just sabotage his projects and ruin the whole plan. Keep this in mind, because it's going to be super important later on. Since both groups wanted totally different things for DC's future, they spent a whole year fighting about it. And these fights got pretty intense, because they felt like the future of their favorite heroes was at stake. That's when the second earthquake hit, Justice League. This movie was also directed by Snyder, but he had to leave the project during post-production, after his daughter passed away. Since Warner didn't really trust Snyder anymore, after all the backlash from Batman v Superman, and now he wasn't even around, they made the sharp turn the anti-Snyders had been asking for. They brought in Joss Whedon and Jeff Johns to finish post-production on Justice League, changing the tone to make it more fun and family-friendly. The look shifted more toward the MCU vibe, with brighter colors. Plus, Superman was now cheerful and friendly. He wasn't the emo guy from Batman v Superman anymore. Now he smiled, talked to kids, and inspired his teammates.
Sounds good to me.
Obviously, the pro-Snyders rejected this change from the start because they felt betrayed by Warner. Some of the anti-Snyders celebrated like they just won the Super Bowl, happy to see Snyder out of the picture. Others were still skeptical, because remember, these fans didn't want Justice League to turn into a cheap knockoff of the Avengers either. What we got in the end was a Frankenstein that didn't please anyone. The reshoots felt totally out of place. There were unresolved subplots, Cavill's face looked super weird, and the whole look of the movie was kind of ugly, since Warner rushed the production to meet the release date. Even though Whedon and Johns kept saying they needed more time to deliver something decent, Warner didn't listen. Both fan groups were unhappy, because neither got what they wanted. This could have been the perfect chance for everyone to unite in frustration and start fresh. If everyone loved DC but disagreed with how Warner had handled things, it was time to look forward and find a new direction for the cinematic universe. But sadly, that didn't happen. The anti-Snyders got over the disappointment of Justice League pretty quickly. It was a movie they didn't even want to watch in the first place, because they couldn't stand Snyder. They just wanted to move on with the same cast, but with new directors telling different stories. stories. Nobody was asking for a soft reboot, because there was no need for one. Superman had already come back to life, and they could tell whatever story they wanted with all the Justice League members. But the pro-Snyders were not over it. Not only did they hate the theatrical cut and feel like it was a slap in the face, they were also convinced there was another version out there that we hadn't seen, something totally different from what hit theaters. That's when the Release the Snyder Cut movement was born. They demanded that Snyder return to DC to release his real version of Justice League. The pro-Snyders were even ready to boycott every future DC project, unless Zack came back.
I'll do whatever's necessary.
From there, extremists started to pop up on both sides. Some anti-Snyders claimed the director's cut didn't even exist, and that everyone was wasting time chasing imaginary things instead of supporting the new, non-Snyder projects. Meanwhile, some pro-Snyders believed the original movie was already finished, and Warner could just press a button and send it to theaters. In the end, neither of those extremes was right. Snyder posted photos confirming that his cut did exist, and he said he'd love the chance to finish it, but it wasn't that simple. There were scenes that had been shot, but never made it to theaters. But since Snyder left before post-production was done, Warner would still need to finish color correction, editing, and all the visual effects. That stuff's not cheap, so the studio had no plans to patch things up with Snyder, just to finish an alternate version of a movie that had already flopped in theaters. The anti-Snyders applauded Warner's stance, because none of them wanted to see the director's cut anyway. But the pro-Snyders started raising funds and putting pressure on the studio any way they could, because they still hadn't lost hope on seeing the director's cut.
I wanna see it.
The online fights kept going for 3 whole years, with fans still arguing about a movie they hadn't even seen. Until 2020, when Warner made another sharp turn. Because of the pandemic, no Hollywood studio could shoot anything, and everyone was trying to make money through streaming subscriptions. But Warner and HBO didn't have anything new to release. Theaters were closed, and filming was on hold. But then they looked around and realized they had all the footage from Justice League sitting there, and a bunch of people were ready to pay for a subscription just to see the Snyder Cut. So they called up Zack and put in $70 million to finish post-production. The pro-Snyders celebrated like crazy, and they felt empowered because the studio had finally responded to their demands, and their movement had worked. They laughed in the faces of the anti-Snyders, making the divide even deeper, and they celebrated all over again in 2021 when the Snyder Cut dropped on HBO Max. This time, some people actually changed their minds. Snyder's version had better pacing, better cinematography, better effects, and overall was way more solid than Whedon's version. Of course, Snyder fans loved it, but it also won over a few of his critics. Social media was full of posts from people who didn't like Batman v Superman, but actually enjoyed Snyder's Justice League. The movie was a huge hit on HBO Max, and for the second time, it seemed like the DC fandom might finally unite, and both sides could stop fighting for good. But the rift just got deeper. The anti-Snyders still didn't trust the director, and the only way they'd accept a continuation of his story was if it happened in some alternate universe, like a fun what-if of sorts. Some even argued the new version wasn't that great either, because it was just the same story, but longer, and with a sepia filter. That kicked off new online fights, and endless comparisons between the two versions. But the real breaking point came when the pro-Snyders decided they weren't done yet. The Snyder Cut wasn't enough. They wanted Zack to make Justice League Part 2, and for him and his wife to be in charge of every DC movie from that point on. Like DC's version of Kevin Feige, except DC Studios didn't exist yet. That was never going to happen, because the relationship between Zack and the Warner execs was completely broken. And let's not forget, half the fandom didn't want anything to do with Snyder's vision. But the pro-Snyder folks felt so empowered after their win that they thought they could get whatever they wanted if they just kept pushing the studio. Anyone who didn't support Snyder coming back was seen as a traitor, and Zack became more than just a director. He turned into the leader of a whole movement. Using his charismatic leader skills, Snyder posted messages like, "If I move forward, follow me. If I fall back, kill me. If I die, avenge me." This had turned into a full-on war over DC's future, fueled by both the Warner execs and Snyder himself. And I know exactly what you're thinking. If the pro-Snyders were real DC fans, shouldn't they have supported the other projects instead of just sticking to one director? Weren't they acting like spoiled kids, blindly following Snyder?
Well, not really.
You see, this is actually a lot like what happens in the comics. When you first get into comics, it's pretty normal to follow the main series of a character you like Superman. But after a few years of reading that character, you start to mature as a reader and realize that there are writers you like more than others. Over time, instead of just following a couple of characters, you start following the writers you like. People like Alan Moore or Mark Waid, and you check out whatever they write, even if it's about characters you don't usually care for. That's how you discover new favorites, because what really grabs you is how those writers see the world. In the end, you stick with writers universe more than with the characters themselves. But that had never really happened in movies before. Some people fell in love with Snyder's vision and didn't want to watch anything else. I know Zack didn't write any of these movies, but the director is the most important person on set when making a film, so he was fully responsible for them. The MCU avoided this from the start by giving all the power to Kevin Feige rather than to individual directors or writers. It's no accident that Feige brought in the Russos only as a last resort to handle the next Avengers movies. Even though the Russos were guaranteed hits every time they worked with Marvel, Feige wanted to give Avengers 5 and 6 to different directors, just to avoid the Russos gaining too much influence. The last thing Marvel wanted was a Russo fan club that would only support their projects and ignore everything else. That's exactly what happened in DC. But after all the toxic back and forth, it finally seemed like the fandom might come together again.
Really?
In 2022, Cavill's Superman showed up in the post-credits scene of Black Adam, and for the first time in 6 years, there was peace. By then, a lot of pro-Snyders had accepted that Zack probably wasn't coming back, but they were ready to boycott everything Warner made. But if they could at least have Cavill back in Man of Steel 2, that could be enough for them. And remember, the anti-Snyders had a grudge against the director, but they had no issue with Cavill as an actor. In fact, a lot of them thought Man of Steel was at least decent, so they were happy to see him return. Of course, there were still some extremists out there fighting over who was right, but it really looked like the DC fandom might unite around Cavill and leave all the divisions behind. But then everything collapsed. Just 2 months after announcing he was back, Cavill posted on social media that he'd had a meeting with James Gunn and he wouldn't be returning as Superman. Turns out, The Rock had pushed the Warner execs to include Henry in a cameo, just because he wanted to face Superman in a future movie and make a bunch of juicy cash. But since Black Adam bombed, the Warner CEO booted The Rock out and handed the keys to DC over to James Gunn, who decided to do a soft reboot to tell the story he wanted. That series of decisions blew the fandom into a million pieces. The die-hard Snyder fans turned into anti-Gunn. They know there's zero chance Snyder is coming back, or that Warner will continue the story with the old cast, so now they just want to watch it all burn, like the Joker. Then you've got the Cavill fans. These folks weren't necessarily Snyder fans, but they did want to keep seeing Cavill as Superman. Now they're unhappy with Gunn, and it's going to take a lot to win them over to the new DCU. There's also a third group, the pro-Gunn crowd. These are the ones who trust Gunn because of his past work. And finally, there are the fans who put Superman above everything else. They're done fighting about which director's best, and they just want to enjoy the new movie and move on from all the old drama. Because of all this, Superman is going to be the biggest challenge of James Gunn's career. He's got to find a way to bring all these scattered fans together behind the new movie, and that's not going to be easy. In this video, I'll break down how he can actually pull it off.
Bye-bye now.